In February of 1585, the city of Antwerp was been under siege by Habsburg forces for over half a year. Surrounded on land and blocked off from the sea, help and supplies could not enter the city. In order to regain access to the sea, the people of Antwerp deployed an early form of weapons of mass destruction. These weapons took the shape of massive floating bombs, which were aptly named the Hellburners. But let us back up first for a bit of context. The siege of Antwerp was part of the 80 Years' War, a conflict fought between Dutch separatists and the Spanish Habsburgs. After some initial successes by the rebels, a large part of the southern Netherlands were recaptured by Habsburg forces in the 1580s. Leading these forces was Alessandro Farnese, governor of the Spanish Netherlands. Farnese was a competent military leader and managed to capture town after town in what is now Belgium. In July 1584, Farnese laid siege to Antwerp, the then capital of the Dutch revolt. The city was a tough nut to crack, as it was heavily fortified and connected to the sea via the river Schelde, allowing the city to be supplied by ship. The defenders also flooded a large part of the region surrounding the city by breaching the dikes along the river. Despite these efforts, the Habsburg forces encircled Antwerp and closed it off from the land. The defenders of the city were not too worried at this stage of the siege, as their supply line via the Schelde River was still open. Bridging or closing off the wide river was considered to be impossible, but this did not stop the Habsburg forces from doing it anyway. Two forts were erected on each side of the Schelde, and a 700-meter bridge was constructed between them. The middle portion of the bridge floated on the river, for which a number of transport ships with a shallow draft called pleiten were used. On both sides of the floating portion of the bridge, rows of boats with long poles were anchored to keep away danger from the bridge. The floating bridge was finished in February 1585. The city now closed off, Farnese only had to wait for the inhabitants to run out of supplies and surrender. Now getting desperate, the defenders of Antwerp tried to destroy the bridge. High hopes were placed in a large floating combat platform which they called the Finis Belli or the Fini la Guerre, which means the end of the war. The platform had room for dozens of cannons and hundreds of musketeers. The craft proved to be very difficult to handle, however. It ran aground and was abandoned in a flooded area north of the city, after which the mighty vessel was redubbed the Lost Expenditure and a clumsy pile of wood. The next attempt to destroy the bridge was made with the Hellburners. These were special fireships designed by the Italian engineer and Antwerp resident Federico Giambelli. Giambelli was born in Mantua in northern Italy somewhere in the middle of the 16th century. Before settling in Antwerp, he moved to Spain and offered his services as a military engineer to the Spanish king Philip II. Giambelli's offer was met with mixed enthusiasm, and he was strung along by the Spanish court without receiving employment. He seems to have not been much of a patriot, as he packed up his things and moved to Antwerp to seek employment there. It was during the siege of Antwerp that he proposed to use fireships to destroy the bridge over the Schelde. Fireships as a concept were nothing new. You basically take a ship you can afford to lose, stuff it with explosives and combustibles, and then send it off to where it needed to explode. What made the Hellburners special was their massive payload of 3.2 tons of high-quality gunpowder. For a bit of context, an average field gun would use only a couple of kilograms per shot, depending on the situation. For his Hellburners, Giambelli was allowed to modify two merchant ships, the Hope and the Fortuin. To ensure maximum damage was done to the bridge, an oblong fire chamber with a diameter of a meter was made on each ship to direct the blast. The cargo bays were fitted with a 5-meter wide brick floor. The side walls of the fire chambers were 1.5 meters thick. The tops of the fire chambers were sealed off with old tombstones and lead. The rest of the cargo bay was filled with rocks and things like metal scraps, turning the ships into enormous fragmentation bombs. The payloads were covered up by normal wooden decks. The Fortuin was to explode using a long, slow-burning fuse. The detonator of the Hope used an innovative combination of a flintlock mechanism and a clockwork provided by a watchmaker. The Hope was outfitted with fake fuses on its deck as well, giving it the appearance of a normal fireship. The Hellburners were deployed in the night of 4 and 5 April 1585. 32 regular fireships were launched first to deceive and distract the Spanish forces, as well as to clear away the row of boats next to the bridge. The current of the river and the low tide of the North Sea carried the fireships downriver towards the bridge. The regular fireships that managed to get close to the bridge caused little damage, but they did keep the Spanish troops occupied. Next up came the Hellburners. The Fortuin ran ashore on the riverbank a distance away from the bridge. When the fuse ran out, the powder charge seems to only have partially exploded, as the ship remained intact. This caused great laughter among the troops defending the bridge. A party of volunteers was sent out by Farnese to inspect the craft and to put out the small remaining fires on her deck. Not much must have been expected from the Hope either. The current carried the ship close to the dike, causing it to evade the row of boats and crash into the non-floating portion of the bridge. Spanish soldiers climbed aboard to extinguish the fake smoldering fuses on the top deck, showing off some of the evil genius behind this vessel. The timer of the real detonator below deck was adjusted well, as not long after reaching the bridge, the ship Alright, the explosion wasn't that big, but it must have been one of the largest man-made explosions produced at that point. The blast could be heard about 80 kilometers away. The ship had vanished, together with her boarders and a large portion of the bridge. The explosion caused the water of the rivers to be cast over the dikes. What followed was a rain of tombstones, rocks, metal scraps and body parts. The rubble of the explosion could be found kilometers away. Alessandro Farnese was close to the blast and nearly perished. He was struck down onto the ground and stunned after being hit in the shoulder by a piece of wood. An officer of one of the bridge's forts was knocked into the air and landed in the river some distance away. He managed to take off his armor underwater and to swim to the shore. A bodyguard of Farnese was knocked into the air as well, and described the experience afterward as being like a cannonball fired from a large cannon. Up to 1,000 soldiers were believed to have been killed by the blast. It is not known how many troops were wounded, but considering the death toll, this number must have been substantial. On a tactical level, the Hellburners were a great success as the bridge was partially destroyed. The whole effort turned out to be an operational failure, however, as neither the defenders nor a relief force from the sea exploited the created breach. In just 3 days, Farnese's engineers and workmen managed to restore the bridge enough to be functional again. No attempts to destroy the bridge were made afterwards. The defenders and relief forces did try to circumnavigate the bridge by trying to breach the Kouwensteinse dike, but this effort failed too. After this, the city was considered to be a lost cause by the rebels, and it surrendered on 17 August 1585. Despite being ultimately unsuccessful in the siege of Antwerp, the Hellburners gained great infamy across Europe. Giambelli moved to England after Antwerp was taken and offered his services to Queen Elizabeth. In 1588, the Spanish Armada was sent north to ferry Farnese's troops from the southern Netherlands to England for an invasion. The Armada was anchored in the Strait of Dover and assumed a defensive formation. The English Navy sent out 8 regular fireships towards them. The Spanish knew that Giambelli served the Queen of England and feared that these fireships were Hellburners too. The ships the English used were also much larger than those used in Antwerp, perhaps giving the Spanish the idea that these were some kind of super Hellburners. The Spanish Armada at first held its position and tried to change the course of the fireships using smaller vessels. The larger vessels were allowed to reel out their anchor ropes if needed to create more distance. When danger was averted, they could then easily resume their original position by reeling in the anchor ropes again. When they only managed to divert the course of 2 of the 8 fireships, a large part of the Armada panicked, cut their anchor ropes and scattered. No Spanish ships were actually lost to the fire, but their defensive formation was broken and could not be reformed quickly. This allowed the English Navy to engage and scatter the Spanish Armada definitively the next day at the Battle of Gravelines. The Spanish were never able to launch their invasion of England, and despite the fact that these Hellburners were actually fake, they contributed to this fact. The English Navy was at the time not even able to build new Hellburners due to gunpowder shortages. Aside from that, Giambelli was working on defensive structures of the Thames River and had no hand in this fireship attack. Even though the use of the Hellburners was unsuccessful in lifting the siege of Antwerp, the reputation of the ships alone was enough to send a large part of the mighty Spanish Armada running. At a strategic level, when looking at the whole war between the Protestant states of Northern Europe and the Habsburg Empire, it can be said that Giambelli's Hellburners were a success after all. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this video interesting. This was my first YouTube video and I would like to make more historical content in the future. If you liked this video, please give a like and subscribe. I hope to see you next time at the Schola Historiae.